She hadn't spoken a full sentence in 4 years. He sat across from her at dinner and decided that was just fine. Texas Hill Country, in the spring of 1879, was a land of live oak and limestone creek and long silences of its own. And it was up the rutted lane to the Whitfield place that Cyrus Trent rode one clear April morning, with his hat in his hand and a proposal of marriage already rehearsed for the eldest Whitfield daughter, a handsome, sharp-tongued young woman named Margaret, whom half the county had been courting without success for 2 seasons running. Cyrus was 36, quiet and careful in his movements the way a man learns to be, who has spent years watching for trouble before it watches for him, his eyes always finding the doors and windows of any room he entered out of an old habit he had never fully managed to shake. And he had ridden with the McCready gang for the better part of 5 hard years in his 20s, robbing banks and rail offices across 3 territories before he had woken one morning in a line shack with a dead man's blood still under his fingernails, and decided, plain and sudden, that he would rather be poor and honest than rich, and hunted the rest of his life. He had walked away clean, taken up ranching under his own true name, rather than hide behind an alias, and spent the 8 years since building 400 quiet acres and a reputation the county had slowly, cautiously come to trust, though not so thoroughly that Ezra Whitfield, Margaret's father, did not enjoy, that April morning, the particular meanness of a small joke at a former outlaw's expense. "Margaret's occupied this morning," Ezra Whitfield said, standing on his own porch with a grin that did not sit well on Cyrus from the first moment he saw it. "But I've another daughter, Mr. Trent, if a wife's what you're set on today. Wren, come out here." A young woman came out onto the porch at her father's call, moving with a careful, watchful economy that told Cyrus a great deal before she ever said a word, and she said no word at all. Only stood at the porch rail with her eyes down and her hands folded, while her father laughed, low and unkind, and the 2 younger Whitfield sons snickered from the yard. "There's my quiet one," Ezra said, enjoying himself thoroughly. "Wren hasn't strung 2 words together in 4 years, not since the wagon accident took her mother and left her half-addled with the grief of it. Reckon she'd suit a man like you fine, Trent. A fellow with his own quiet history might not mind a wife who can't ask him awkward questions about it." He laughed again at his own joke, and 2 of his sons laughed with him, and only Wren Whitfield's mother's old dog, sitting close by her feet, seemed to mark that the joke had landed somewhere it was not meant kindly to land. The accident itself was a thing the whole county knew in outline, and no one in the Whitfield household spoke of directly anymore, as though silence about it might undo, retroactively, the 4 years of silence it had caused. Wren had been driving the family wagon down the steep creek road with her mother beside her, 18 years old and proud to have finally been trusted with the reins alone. When a rattler had spooked the team on a blind curve above the ford, the wagon had gone over, and Wren had been thrown clear with nothing worse than a broken wrist, and her mother had not been thrown clear at all. Wren had crawled back to her, in the mud and the wreckage, and held her the better part of an hour before help came, and had not, by every account the county could offer, spoken a full sentence since, not because the doctor could find any wound to explain it, but because Wren herself had decided, in some wordless reckoning no one had ever managed to draw out of her, that the reins had been her charge, and the death had been her failing, and that a person who has failed so completely at the one thing asked of her has very little left worth saying. Cyrus Trent did not laugh. He looked at the young woman standing at the rail, perhaps 24, plain dressed, her dark hair pulled back plain and severe, her eyes, when they lifted once to meet his before dropping away again, deep and quick and entirely, unmistakably aware. And he saw, in that single-held glance, not the addled simpleness her father's joke implied, but something else altogether. A woman who had gone silent on purpose, or near enough to purpose, and who watched the whole of the world with a wary intelligence her family had simply stopped troubling to notice. "Well," Cyrus said slowly, turning his hat in his hands, "I came up this lane figuring on a wife, Mr. Whitfield, and I don't much care whose company I keep at supper so long as it's honest company. I'll take supper with Miss Wren, if she'll have me, and we'll see from there whether either of us has any objection to the arrangement." Ezra Whitfield's grin faltered, uncertain whether his joke had been accepted or turned back on him, and Wren Whitfield lifted her eyes once more, and this time did not drop them quite so quickly. He stayed for supper that evening, and every evening for the next several weeks, and it was over that first meal, watching Wren Whitfield eat in careful silence, while her brothers talked over her, and her father ignored her entirely, that Cyrus Trent began to understand exactly what 4 years of being treated as an embarrassment had done to a woman who had once, by all account, been the liveliest talker in the household. She did not pass him the bread. She set it before him, deliberate, unhurried, watching to see whether he took the heel or the middle slice. And when he took the heel without comment, something in her face eased by the smallest fraction, and Cyrus understood, without either of them saying a single word, that he had just answered some small private test she set for every stranger at her table, and passed it. Before the month was out, Cyrus Trent had stopped asking after Margaret Whitfield entirely, and had begun instead to learn the particular wordless language of Wren's world. The way she touched 2 fingers to the back of her wrist when the coffee wanted refilling, rather than interrupt a conversation to ask. The way she tapped once on the table's edge when a story at supper had run long enough that the listener's patience was fraying. A small, dry joke only Cyrus, watching closely, ever caught her making, the way she went still and canted her head before a storm broke, hearing something in the wind the rest of the household never noticed until the first fat drops came down. He began coming not merely to court her, but simply to sit with her, some afternoons, in the kitchen garden where she worked her herbs and simples with a quiet, sure competence the county whispered about uneasily, for Wren Whitfield had a gift with growing things and ailing creatures that unsettled folks who did not understand it. A hand that could calm a colicking horse or draw a fever down with nothing but crushed leaves and patience, and a silence that made the superstitious among them mutter about her being touched, when in truth Cyrus came slowly to understand she was simply the most closely attending person he had ever met, watching everything and everyone with an unhurried care her family had trained itself to overlook entirely. "You don't talk to fill the quiet," Cyrus said to her one afternoon, sitting on an upturned bucket while she worked crushed comfrey into a poultice for a lamb with a torn leg. "Most folks can't abide a silence. Talk right through anything worth hearing just to keep it from settling. You let it settle." Wren looked up at him, and though she said nothing, she held his gaze a long moment, and then, deliberate, reached out and set 2 fingers lightly on the back of his own weathered hand, the same small gesture she used at the supper table to ask, without words, whether he wanted more coffee. And Cyrus understood it, this time, for something considerably warmer than a question about coffee, and felt something in his own long guarded chest come loose at the plain, unexpected gift of it. Word of the courtship spread through the county before either of them had spoken of it as such, and it drew, as such things do, its share of unkind comment. Women at the church social wondering aloud what a man wanted with a wife who couldn't so much as thank him for his trouble. Men at the feed store remarking that a former outlaw and a half-mute girl made a fitting enough pair, since neither had much to say for themselves. Cyrus heard every word of it eventually, the way a small county's gossip always finds its way home, and answered none of it directly, choosing instead to be seen driving Wren to church each Sunday with a courtesy no gossip could argue against, and to be seen, more than once, laughing outright at some small dry joke of hers that only he had caught, in the particular way that told anyone watching closely that the joke had landed exactly where she meant it to. There came an afternoon in May when Cyrus brought a sick foal to Wren's garden gate, a spindly, fevered thing its own mother had nearly rejected, and watched her work through the night at its side with a patience that undid him more thoroughly than any spoken tenderness could have. Near dawn, the foal's fever broke, and it staggered up on its own thin legs for the first time, and Wren, exhausted and triumphant, turned to Cyrus with an unguarded joy on her face that he had not yet seen from her, and for a long moment neither of them moved, the gray light coming up over the pasture, her hand still resting on the foal's damp neck, his own hand resting, without his quite deciding it should, over hers. Neither of them drew back. The whole tired, triumphant dawn held its breath around the two of them, close enough now that Cyrus could count the small flecks of hay caught in her loosened hair, close enough that the half-inch between them felt, to both of them, like the largest and smallest distance either had ever measured. It would have taken nothing at all to close it. Cyrus, who had spent 8 years teaching himself not to want things he was not certain he deserved, found himself wanting this with a plainness that frightened him a little. And Wren, watching him hesitate, reached up instead and set 2 fingers against his jaw. Not the coffee sign, not the danger sign, but something new, invented in that single gray moment that both of them understood without translation to mean stay. He did not kiss her that dawn. He judged, rightly, that the moment belonged to the foal and the exhaustion and the particular fragile trust of it, and that whatever came next between them deserved to be chosen deliberately rather than seized in the tiredness of a long night's vigil. But he carried the warmth of her fingers against his jaw the whole ride home, and understood, by the time he reached his own gate, that he had stopped thinking of his visits to the Whitfield place as courtship at all, and started thinking of them, plainly, as coming home. It was some weeks later, on an evening he had come to sit with her in the garden past sundown, that Cyrus told her the whole truth of his own quiet history, because he had decided, watching her work in patient silence beside him, that a woman who had earned the right to keep her own silence deserved a man honest enough not to keep his. "I rode with bad men once," Cyrus said, low, into the dusk. 5 years of it. Robbed banks, robbed rail offices, watched a man die in a line shack with my own hands not far off from the doing of it, and woke up one morning knowing I could not go on being the man that life was making of me. I walked away, Wren, built this ranch clean, under my own name, and have spent 8 years hoping the men I rode with had either forgotten me or died before they thought to come looking. I don't know which is more likely, and some nights it troubles my sleep considerable. He turned his hat in his hands, an old habit when the words came hard. I'm telling you plain because I figure a woman who's spent 4 years being talked around instead of talked to deserves better than a man who does the same thing to his own history. You don't owe me a word back, Wren. I'd take your silence over another man's lies any day of the week. Wren Whitfield set down her mortar and pestle and reached, slow and deliberate, into the small carved box she kept her working tools in, and drew out a smooth length of pale cottonwood and a whittling knife Cyrus had not known she carried. And over the next several evenings, working in the same unhurried silence that governed everything she did, she carved him a small wooden bird, a plain wren no bigger than his thumb, and pressed it into his palm without a word, closing his rough fingers over it with both her small hands. He understood, holding that small carved bird, that it was the whole of what she had to say in answer to everything he had just confessed, and that it was, in its own quiet way, considerably more than most men ever heard said plainly aloud, before the summer's heat settled fully over the hill country. And it would, soon enough, the way Texas summers always did. There was a stretch of golden spring weeks in which a former outlaw and a silent woman built. Gesture by careful gesture. A language the rest of the county could not read at all. If you have stayed with this story so far, stay a little longer. What happens next is the part that changes everything. And if tales of love that outlast the hardest country the West could offer are the kind that keep you company, the small bell beneath this story is how we go on meeting like this. The trouble Cyrus Trent had long feared came riding up his own lane on a hot June afternoon in the shape of a lean, hard-eyed man named Wren Whitfield, the last surviving member of the old McCready gang still willing to ride, and Cyrus knew, the instant he recognized that particular unhurried, dangerous slouch in the saddle, that 8 years of quiet had finally run out. "Trent," Wren said, not troubling to dismount. "Or ought I still call you what the boys used to? Heard you'd gone respectable." "Rancher." "Is it?" Fine spread. His eyes traveled, deliberate, over the house and the barn and lingered, for one calculating moment, on Wren Whitfield working in the kitchen garden within easy sight of the porch. "I've a proposition, old friend. There's a payroll shipment coming through the hill country next month. Careless guarded, easy money for a man who still remembers how the old tricks run. I need a fourth. You're the best hand I ever rode with, and I find myself in need of exactly that." "I'm out, Wren," Cyrus said, flat and final. "Told you and the rest of the boys 8 years back. I don't ride that road any more. Everybody's out till they're needed back in," Wren said, unbothered, and let his gaze drift once more, pointed and unmistakable, toward the garden. "That your woman yonder? Quiet little thing. I expect a man's got a good deal more to lose, going respectable, than he ever had riding free. Think on the proposition, Trent. I'll be back through in a fortnight for your answer, and I'd hate to see a man's new life come apart over a stubbornness he can't rightly afford." Cyrus watched him ride off with a coldness settling deep in his gut, for he understood exactly what Wren Whitfield's lingering look had meant, and exactly what kind of leverage a desperate outlaw would not hesitate to use against a man who had gone soft with respectability and something worth protecting. He told Wren the whole of it that same evening, plain and complete, holding nothing back the way he had promised himself he never would with her, and Wren listened in her familiar attentive silence, and when he finished, she rose and crossed to the small carved box on her work table and drew from it a second wooden bird she had evidently already begun. Unprompted, some days before, not a wren this time, but a hawk, sharp-winged and watchful, and she pressed it into his hand alongside the first. "You're telling me you mean to watch for him?" Cyrus said, understanding slowly, "same as I mean to watch out for you." Wren nodded once, firm, and touched 2 fingers first to her own chest, and then to his, a gesture she had never made before, and one Cyrus understood, without any need of further translation, as plainly as any spoken vow. Wren Whitfield did not wait the fortnight he had promised. He came back in 8 days instead, at dusk, with 2 other hard-faced men Cyrus did not recognize, having decided that a rancher too stubborn to see reason might see it faster with his woman held as the argument. It was Wren's own watchfulness, the same unhurried attention the whole county mistook for simpleness, that gave Cyrus the warning he needed. She had marked, 3 evenings running, a rider studying the ranch's comings and goings from the tree line at the property's edge, a stillness in the brush that did not match the deer's stillness, a horse's shape too well fed and too well tacked to belong to any hand from a neighboring spread, and had signaled it to Cyrus each time with the small private sign they had built together for danger, 2 fingers tapped twice against her own wrist, long before Roan's men ever showed themselves openly. On the 3rd evening, she had gone further still, slipping out after dark to study the tracks left at the tree line's edge by lantern light hooded under her shawl, and had come back to sketch, in the dirt of the porch step where Cyrus would see it at dawn, a rough map of exactly where the watcher had stood each night and which direction he had ridden off in. A piece of plain, careful scouting that would have done credit to any tracker Cyrus had ever ridden with in his outlaw years, offered without a single word because words had never once been the true measure of what Wren Whitfield was capable of noticing. So when Roan Higby and his 2 riders came down on the ranch that dusk meaning to take Wren quiet and use her as the lever they needed, they found Cyrus Trent waiting for them in the yard with his rifle already up, and Wren herself, far from the frightened, addled woman Roan had judged her to be from one careless glance across a garden fence, positioned at the barn door with a shotgun of her own, steady-handed and entirely unafraid, having spent 4 supposedly silent years watching this exact kind of danger approach a household that had never once thought to arm her against it. "You misjudged her, Roan," Cyrus said, into the tense standoff, his rifle steady on the lead rider even as his voice stayed level and unhurried, the same careful calm Wren herself had taught him to trust more than shouting ever could. "Whole county's misjudged her 4 years running, on account of she doesn't waste breath where it isn't wanted. She's been watching your man in the tree line 3 evenings straight, and told me plain as anything the moment you showed yourselves. Sketched his tracks in the dirt of my own porch step so I'd know exactly where to look. You want to test whether a silent woman shoots straighter than a talking one, you go right ahead. I wouldn't wager against her, and I've ridden with enough gun hands in my time to know a steady one when I see it." One of Roan's men, unnerved by the sight of a second armed and steady gun where he had been promised a helpless woman, lost his nerve first and wheeled his horse for the tree line without waiting for his companions. And that single crack in their resolve was enough. Roan Higby, seeing his easy leverage evaporate and his numbers thin in the same breath, weighed the cost of pressing a fight against 2 people who plainly would not break, and chose, in the end, the coward's calculation that had likely kept him alive through every other close call of his outlaw years. "This ain't finished, Trent," Roan said, backing his horse toward the lane. "It is for tonight," Cyrus said, "and if you come back a 3rd time, I'll see the marshal in town hears the whole history of the McCready gang's last living member, and let the law finish what your own nerve just couldn't." Roan Higby did not come a 3rd time. Word reached the hill country within the month that he had been taken up in a botched robbery 2 counties over and hanged for it that autumn. The last of the old gang gone the way most such men eventually went in Cyrus Trent's own quiet past, once the county heard the fuller story through the marshal's own account of the standoff, was judged, by most of his neighbors, a history a man had honestly outrun rather than a stain that still marked him. Ezra Whitfield, who had sent his silent daughter out as a joke and lived to see her stand armed and steady against 3 hardened outlaws while the rest of his household cowered indoors, never made light of Wren again, and told the story himself in later years with a shamed sort of pride that came a good deal too late to undo 4 years of careless cruelty, though Wren, in her own quiet way, let him keep the telling of it, because she had learned long before that some kinds of forgiveness cost the forgiver nothing and were worth granting regardless. Cyrus and Wren were married that autumn at the ranch, with the whole county come to see the wedding of the quiet sister everyone had once written off as a joke. The same porch where her father had once called her out to be laughed at, now decorated with late wildflowers, and the whole yard full of neighbors, who had by then learned better than to underestimate her twice. Wren, standing at the small country altar, surprised the gathered guests by speaking her vows aloud in a voice gone rusty from 4 years' disuse, but entirely her own. The first full sentence most of the county had heard her say since her mother's death, offered not because anyone demanded it of her, but because she had decided, watching Cyrus Trent learn her whole wordless language without once asking her to abandon it, that some words were finally worth spending again. Ezra Whitfield's shame did not undo the years, but it softened him in a way the county noted with some surprise, and he took, in his last years, to sitting quietly on Cyrus and Wren's own porch of an evening, watching his daughter work her garden with a respect he had never once thought to offer while she lived under his own roof, and telling anyone who would listen that he had raised a remarkable woman without once having the sense to see it, until a stranger with his own hard history showed him how. Margaret Whitfield, for her part, married a cattle buyer from San Antonio the following year, and bore Cyrus and Wren no ill will at all for the joke that had, in the end, worked out rather better for her sister than her father had ever intended. She wrote Wren long, cheerful letters twice a year, and Wren, her voice slowly returning to ordinary daily use, wrote back in a hand that had grown, over 4 silent years, considerably more expressive than her old spoken chatter had ever managed to be. They kept the small carved birds on the mantel of the home they built together, the wren and the hawk set side by side, and added to them, over the years, a whole small flock of Wren's own careful carving, a sign for morning, a sign for storm coming, a sign for I am glad you are home, a private language that never stopped growing between them even after Wren's voice slowly came back to ordinary use, because both of them had learned, in that first silent spring, that some of the truest things a person can say to another were never going to need words at all. Their own children, 3 of them born over the years that followed, grew up fluent in both languages at once, chattering in ordinary speech at the supper table, and yet, without any of them quite remembering being taught it, reaching instinctively for their mother's small silent signs whenever the moment called for something words could not quite carry, a habit of attention, passed down without a single lesson, that marked every Trent child in the county as unusually gentle with frightened animals, and unusually patient with anyone the rest of the world had grown too impatient to properly hear. Cyrus never did stop carrying the first wooden wren she had ever carved him, keeping it always in his coat pocket long after the coat itself had been replaced twice over, worn smooth by years of his own thumb turning it absently the way another man might turn a lucky coin, not for luck, he told his eldest son once, when the boy finally asked, but because a man ought to keep some plain reminder, always close at hand, of the exact moment somebody decided his silence and hers were worth learning to speak the same tongue. If your heart has ever leaned toward a story where love arrived not through grand declaration but through the patient work of finally being understood, then this story was for you. Out on the limestone hills of Texas, where the wind keeps the only memory of what was, the love between Cyrus Trent and the woman the world had stopped listening to became the kind that does not need anyone to remember it to be real. They gave him the quiet sister as a joke. He learned her whole language and never once needed her to speak it to know exactly what she meant. If stories of frontier love that endured through hardship, misjudgment, and the kind of quiet courage only the West seems to demand speak to something in you, follow the lonesome trail for more. Here the love stories are quiet, the courage is real, and the last word is always worth the wait. Until the next trail.